Hello. So my name is Dr. David Francis. Thank you very much for listening to this video. I prepared this in advance of our interpretation session our next Wednesday, in which we'll be looking at the interpretation strategies and doing some text writing for the Nursing Support Workers exhibition at the Royal College of Nursing. Um, I like to do these videos because there's a lot of kind of theory about interpretation and ideas that are around it that we won't necessarily have time to do on Wednesday when I want the session to be very kind of active and involving you in dialogue and not me giving a kind of a lecture to you. But this and format enables me to kind of give some of the kind of the thinking behind the ideas that I'll be talking about to you in greater depth and hopefully prepare you for the session on Wednesday, which I very much look forward to seeing you at. So, who am I? My name is Dr. David Francis. I'm a lecturer at University College London, where I specialise in memory, museums and heritage. I'm also a museums and heritage professional, and I've worked previously at the British Museum, the British Library and the Grand Egyptian Museum in Egypt. So these are some of the exhibitions I've worked on previously: A History of the World in 100 Objects at the British Museum, the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo, India in the World at the CSMVS Museum in Mumbai, the Sadberk Hanam Museum in Istanbul, the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage Project at the British Library in London, and at Turayf in Saudi Arabia. So when we meet next week on Wednesday, the schedule for the interpretation day is going to be that we'll introduce ourselves and then we'll talk about the big ideas and themes of the exhibition. We'll think about the 3 themes that the exhibition has that you've identified in the scope and where you see your own particular research or interest fitting. We'll then take a break and then we'll think about the process of text writing, and we'll take some example objects and have a go at drafting text for them. And then finally we'll share some of these texts and we'll discuss. But what I want to kind of do today is sort of lay the groundwork for this and introduce you to some of the key concepts of interpretation. And I'll be retouching on these in the session on Wednesday. But just doing this pre-record allows me to go into a little bit more depth about them. Firstly, what is interpretation? Well, I like to define it and think about the interpretation developer as sitting between the figure of the curator, who's the subject specialist, the designer who creates the space, and the audience who experience the exhibition. And a good starting point for this idea of interpretation is by Freeman Tilden, often seen as the godfather of North American interpretation, which begins in the kind of National Park Service. And his famous quote is, "The chief aim of interpretation is not instruction, but provocation." That is, you're not just creating text for people to learn something from, but to provoke their interest. And this is a useful mantra to take with us as we design our exhibition interpretation. Now, on a very basic level, we might think of interpretation as exhibition text, which we can divide into 2 types. That are exhibition panels. These are often found on the wall of a museum space, which contain the wider, broader contextual information about a time period. In this case, the geometric and archaic period of Greece, quite an obscure one there. And then we can think about another type of text, which is object labels. And these typically sit with the object in the case, and they describe what the object is, often with a title, telling you where the object is made, what its date is, and also some information about what and why the object is important. However, we can broaden out this very text-based focus on what interpretation is to instead think about it as being the integration of all exhibition elements to tell a story to the visitors. And on the screen, you have now an image of an exhibition I worked on in the British Museum back in 2010 called Akan Drum, in which you have a single object, the Akan Drum, in the center of the room. But then on the wall, you have this very kind of visually, graphically arresting design showing the kind of the development of contemporary music. From African drumming all the way through things like field calls, through to blues, jazz, rap, R&B, and that was kind of accompanied by a soundtrack featuring all of these different genres of music. So the idea that interpretation can be all of those elements that come together that help tell that story to visitors. And I think another useful way to think about interpretation is to think about what you're trying to evoke in your visitor. And I'm going to argue that what you're trying to do is create a sense of revelation or epiphany or connection with the material that they see in front of them. I'm going to give you an example here from the exhibition Life and Death in Pompeii and Herculaneum from 2013. This is a case containing doctors' medical instruments that was found in Pompeii. And this is from a visitor, Deborah, who's 35, who's a doctor. And she describes how encountering these objects makes her feel a connection with a person living in the past. So she describes these objects and says, it's the stuff that you don't expect that moves you the most. They just remind us they were just normal people. And she relates this to her own profession as a doctor. She says, well, medically, the medical instruments, that was quite nice. That poor guy, I assume it was a guy, had his tweezers and his surgical instruments, not by chance. If you're ever in any kind of stop at the roadside, if there's a car accident or something, you've got a wee bit of kit in your car, but I totally understand why you'd have his case with him. I totally understand it because you always think you can help. So she is looking back 2,000 years to think about this doctor and seeing how, reading into him and the objects that he's got with him, the motivation that she herself shares as a medical professional. And I want to argue, when you're writing and thinking about your objects, how can you connect people to them? How can you reach out to other nursing support workers to make that kind of connection? And we're going to structure this idea about thinking about interpretation into 4 parts. We're going to think about the big idea that drives an exhibition. We'll think about narrative, about storytelling and how we structure stories and use themes to bring about a visitor journey through an exhibition. We're going to think about the concept of voice in the exhibition. Who is speaking and what is the tone of voice that we adopt? And then we're going to think about this and apply it to writing exhibition text. How do we put that tone of voice into our exhibition text? So we're going to begin with this concept of the big idea. Section 1, what's the big idea? And this is a concept that comes from the American interpretation specialist Beverly Sorrell. And she outlines it in her foundational text, Exhibit Labels, an Interpretive Approach. And she describes the big idea as a sentence, a statement of what the exhibition will be about. It is one complete, non-compound, active sentence that identifies a subject, an action, the verb, and consequence. So what? I'm going to give you an example of this. This is an exhibition from Chicago in the Science Center about the big idea of a swamp exhibit. And this big idea is healthy cypress swamps and Illinois wetland, examples of threatened ecosystems, provide many surprising benefits to humans. And within this, you can see kind of Beverly Sorrell's idea about, the big idea is a kind of a noun. It's got to be something it's about swamps. It's got to be active. There's got to be something that's happening there, which is the kind of that it provides. And, what is the, thing that's important? Why should we care? What's the hook? That it provides many surprising benefits to humans. And I think although we don't have to be so strict as to go, with Sorrell's idea of a big idea by verbatim, I think this idea of saying, it's got to be about something and it's got to be active and there's got to be a reason people should care about it is a useful way to hone a big idea. And when we meet next week on Wednesday, I'm going to be asking you for your big idea for the Nursing Support Worker exhibition and just what's quite useful is to sort of think about this in relationship to the previous exhibition, Unmasked, Real Stories of Nursing in COVID-19, Humans Not Heroes, where you have this big idea for Unmasked was that nursing staff are skilled professionals doing a difficult job at a time of national emergency, not the heroes represented in the press. And my kind of questions for you is, what is the big idea for your exhibition about nursing support workers? What perceptions are you trying to change? Why is this particularly relevant now? And I know that some of the ideas that are coming out of your scoping sessions already are: we all need nursing support workers. Nursing support workers get to know patients as people, not just as patients. Nursing support workers play a crucial role in providing us all with care. Nursing support work as unregistered but not unskilled, in a way that could be seen as the kind of perception that you're trying to change. So let's take some of those these ideas, these concepts, and see how we can put this together to form the driving big idea behind the exhibition. And I think it's important when we think about this big idea, that also that it's feeding in by the aims of the exhibition, which, as I understand from the scope paper, are raise awareness of nursing support workers and the Royal College of Nursing's committee, capture the progression of the nursing support worker role, raise the profile and understanding of the role, make nursing support workers feel valued, emphasize the importance of the essential care nursing support workers provide. Now I'm going to move us now on to section 2, themes and narrative structure. And I'm going to be using again examples like the Life and Death in Pompeii and Herculaneum exhibition to that we spoke about earlier in terms of that example, to give an idea about how we go about forming themes and structure in exhibitions. So in that exhibition, Life and Death in Pompeii and Herculaneum, within the exhibition title itself, you can see 2 themes which are put together in opposition to create dynamic tension. That is life and death. And when visitors came into the first part of the exhibition, they encountered 3 objects which you can see in front of you. One of them is a cast of a body of a dog that died in Pompeii. One of them is a fresco on a wall showing people eating grapes and reclining in a villa, and one is a charred stool from Herculaneum. And the curator described how these 3 objects came together to speak to each other in dialogue, to speak to 3 big overarching themes of these exhibitions. So these were life and death, so death here represented by the dead dog, life by people on the frescoes. Pompeii and Herculaneum, the dog comes from Pompeii and the stool comes from Herculaneum, and old friends and new discoveries. So when people think about the Pompeii, they think often about the casts of the bodies, like the dog, when in fact there's also these new discoveries being made, such as at Herculaneum, which is less well known than Pompeii, such as the charred stool, which, because of the different way that the eruption happened, things are preserved in these ash-like forms in a way that they're not preserved in Pompeii. When we think about narrative in the museum, we can say one of the things is the essence of narrative is change, that we are trying to tell a story of change across time, but also as visitors move through the exhibition, that their perspectives are changed. And within this idea of how we construct narratives in the museum, I'm going to argue there's 2 key elements. One is structure, and one is voice. And I've represented structure here in this narrative arc. You know, how narrative can build to a climax in which a revelation takes place. And this is the key way that dramas construct narrative. And we can do a similar thing when we are working with museum exhibitions. And I'm going to look at the previous exhibition about the history of children's nursing that took place at the Royal College of Nursing exhibition space as the previous exhibition, and think about how it uses the space. And we can think about this as almost like 3 acts, with the first act being history and origins of children nursing, act 2 being something about the education and role in children's nursing, and Act 3 being something about the history of emotional well-being in children's nursing, and then a kind of conclusion panel that wraps it up. And you're using the same space, so it's interesting to either say this is we want to kind of go in a similar way to this, or this is, or we want to do something different. And it's important when we think about narrative in the museum that we always think about it both in terms of text and objects, but also in terms of space. So how do those themes map onto space? And when we look at that previous exhibition about the history of children's nursing, we can think about this, how each display case, each act, act also fits itself onto one of the individual kind of wall spaces within the exhibition space at the RCN. We can see how those kind of key messages then map onto the themes for each display case. So, for display case 1, we have the history and origins of children's nursing. So things to talk about here are early healers who cared for children, origins of children nursing in the founding hospital, Great Ormond Street and development of hospitals, especially for children. In display case 2, we focus on the educational role in children's nursing and say, make the case for why we need children's nurses. Talk about the training path of children's nurses, key figures in the history of children's nursing, such as June Jolly and partnership care in the hospital. And then in display case 3, the kind of explore the concept of the history of emotional well-being in children's nursing. Think about society's changing view of children, the emergence of children's rights, and how this is reflected in things like the beginning of open visiting, the history of mental health nursing for children, and the introduction of hospice care for children. And one of the things that kind of stood out in this exhibition in terms of its interpretive scheme was creating a timeline about the history of caring for children. And is this something that we want to kind of create and think about for, the timeline for nursing support workers? And this can often, even if it's not included in the exhibition, be a useful kind of narrative planning tool for you about what are the key moments that you need to include and address. And then the conclusion panel provides the opportunity to say how some of these historical elements are still present in contemporary times, how inequality and access to healthcare has or hasn't changed, and also look towards the future and say, what is the future of children's nursing? How does this speak to now? So now let's turn to your exhibition about nursing support workers and think about how we might map those themes and messages onto the exhibition. So as I understand it from the scope paper, your key messages are nursing support work has a long history and has been a crucial part of healthcare for a long time. Nursing support work takes many forms, it takes place in many different settings. Nursing support workers care and connect with patients at a personal level, and nursing support workers can be the eyes and ears of a team. Out of these key messages, you then have these agreed themes, which are number 1, mental health and asylum attendants, 2, VADs in World War I and World War II, number 3, diversity and the Windrush generation, and number 4, nursing associates and the modern era. You also have other elements at play, such as, the lightbox graphic, potential objects, timeline, artistic commissions and partnership ideas, including care home partnerships, and Fade's visual minutes, possibly changing around the structure of the exhibition. So these are all things to sort of include and balance in with your themes. And then the scope paper outlines that for display case 1, this is where you're going to have this theme of the early history of support works and the VADs and asylum attendants. And the stories around this are going to be things around 19th century asylum attendants were not trained nurses. Men and women learned on the job. They were expected to keep and perform medical and non-medical tasks, for example, playing the hospital band. And then you have objects like Josephine Angois's scrapbook and correspondence regarding VAD work, and also portable device for recording patrols from the Sussex Asylum from the mid-19th century, borrowed from the Science Museum. Display place 2 looks at the mid-20th century and addresses things around the Windrush movement and also diversity. And so you've potentially got stories and photographs from the Migration Museum, stories and photographs from the cultural history of the NHS. And I think it seems like for this one, you need to sort of outline a little bit more about what you want to kind of say, what's your take on these, and also see if there's any objects that you can use to illustrate these points. And then in display case 3, you look at nursing support work today. So you have stories, thinking about care in different settings, how you connect with patients, nurses support workers day established in 2020, and objects such as the Chief Nurse Award. So, the exhibition has this kind of chronological kind of overview as you move around. And I know you have a variety of objects, such as this service scrapbook by Josephine Angwai. And these are what we're going to be using to act as inspiration for our writing exercise, which we'll do in the second part of the session. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about structure here and how we think about how we tell a story and how we write text based on the type of space and structure that we adopt. And there's two kind of main ways that I want to divide structure within the museum space. That is linear and non-linear. And these have some important differences. So for a linear experience, these are often sort of exhibitions in which visitors are often intending to come, that you're coming and spending a long time, such as 90 minutes for a blockbuster. Visitors often have specialist knowledge about a subject matter, and visitors read text panels. So things like that Pompeii and Herculaneum exhibition that I talked about at the British Museum, this would be an example of a linear experience. Non-linear experiences are typically visitors are just wandering into a space. They have a short dwell time. Visitors have little knowledge about the subject matter. And visitors look at objects, but they don't read text. And this is often takes place in free galleries of an institution, which people are kind of walking through. So at the British Museum, the majority of galleries are free. People are walking through them, and they're just stopping at the objects that kind of catch their attention. And I think we might think about the RTN space, as a little bit in between the two. You're going to have some visitors who are coming and following the narrative, but other visitors who are just using the library space and stopping at things that catch their eye. So I'm going to talk you through how the narrative of a linear exhibition works. This is Hajj, Journey to the Heart of Islam at the British Museum, held in 2012. So this was an exhibition about the Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. The exhibition had 4 main areas: the introduction, the journey, arriving in Mecca, and then the homecoming. So there is a real kind of structure around a journey of reaching a kind of point and then return as the exhibition's overall kind of narrative arc. In the introduction area, introduce you to some of the key elements of Hajj, what it was, big textiles to kind of catch your eye as you came into the space. And you also had contemporary photography of pilgrims kind of marching, wearing the adan, the traditional white robe, in which kind of acts to kind of remove barriers and trappings and create pilgrims as kind of a unified collective. And the idea is kind of you two are kind of setting out on this pilgrimage to Mecca. The journey had this kind of historical overview of the different routes people had taken of the Hajj over time. There were 5 routes that were chosen. And you had big objects, historical objects like the Makmal, which were used to kind of in big processions going from Cairo to Mecca. There is these kind of big kind of historical objects. So in a similar way, kind of to your exhibition has this historical part at the start. So did this exhibition. Visitors then arrived in the Mecca section of the exhibition, where they were confronted with these huge textiles that would cover the Kaaba, which is the black cube in which Muslims, pilgrims circumambulate once they arrive in Mecca as part of the rituals of Hajj. But they'd also had contemporary artworks, such as this artwork by Ahmad Marta, Magnetism, which you have these iron filings sort of standing up next to this kind of black cube magnet, and then you have digital media which explains the kind of the rituals of the Hajj. Finally, you had the homecoming, which included souvenirs that people had taken back from Hajj, voices of pilgrims talking about their experience, and commissioned artworks reflecting on kind of what people took with them from their Hajj journey. And you can see kind of how the exhibition has this kind of beginning, setting out of a journey, this journey itself, reaching Mecca, and then coming back as its kind of conclusion. And we can kind of see that as well within your kind of 3 acts and a conclusion panel that you have for the exhibition. And we can see how these kind of, these different stages come together to form this idea of a narrative arc, that you're building anticipation towards what you're going to encounter in Act 3, this kind of encounter with these big textiles from Mecca, these kind of contemporary artworks. And that's also what I encourage you to think about. How can you use a key object within your exhibition or build towards this kind of encounter that you might have within your, nursing support workers today section. So now let's contrast the idea of the linear space with a non-linear space, using the example of the medieval gallery at the British Museum. And to reiterate, this is one of 93 galleries at the British Museum, and the majority of visitors are kind of coming to the British Museum for 2 hours. So as they move through these 3 galleries, they don't have a lot of time to spend in the space, and they're typically stopping at individual objects that catch their eye. And so the gallery interpretation is deliberately designed to kind of to work with this visitor dynamic. So how it does this, it structures the exhibition through an idea of gateway objects. And these are gallery gateways and section gateways. And basically the idea is that people aren't going to stop at the panels to read the text, but you can use key objects that visitors will stop at to introduce the key themes that you want to do at the gallery, within the gallery. So the key objects for the medieval gallery at the British Museum are the Lewis chessmen, famous, featured in the Harry Potter films, and they're used to introduce different aspects of medieval life, which correspond to the structure and space of the exhibition. And it's worth thinking within your own exhibition, what are the key objects that you might have in each kind of section to kind of introduce the theme of the case. If the visitors are only going to read and look at one object within that section, what's it going to be? So a gateway object like the Lewis chessmen combines object and contextual information together to introduce the key themes of the gallery. And you can use things like the Lewis chessmen to explore one of the big themes like medieval feudal society. You have the different strata of society there. You have the king, the queen, the knight, the bishop. You have medieval faith because you have the figure of the bishop, but also that chess was first played in Europe by the clergy. And then you have this theme of cross-cultural connections because chess comes into Europe from India via Islamic Spain. So you have this idea of ideas moving and traveling, which counters some of those, perhaps what we might think of conflict and clash of civilization narratives that are often common with the medieval period about the Crusades. And we can see that the actual this is how the actual theme of the gallery, its actual space, is kind of designed, where you have kind of 3 central themes: society, cross-cultural connections, and faith. And then from that, you have individual cases that kind of go into this in more depth. So for the society case, you kind of work your way along the different aspects of medieval society, starting with kings and queens, going to bishops, then knights, and then going to peasants. And similarly, cross-cultural connections, looks at the Islamic world and looks at the Crusades and draws contrasts and brings in different perspectives on both of these. This is an approach that's very much based on data on how people actually behave within a space. So when we actually look at the medieval gallery at the British Museum, we can see that case that contains the main gallery gateway, the Lewis chessmen, is stopped at by 49% of visitors. So the majority, the case that's the most popular one, corresponds with the one that's delivering the kind of the key overriding message of the gallery. And I can show you another example of this. So this is the money gallery. You're seeing the kind of one of the gateway objects in there, which is a set of pound coins, half of which are real and half of which are counterfeit, which talks about the nature of money and authenticity. And we can see that when we look at the gallery, that case that they're in contains 44% of visitors stop at that. Whereas if we look at the introductory panels in the gallery, P1, P2, P3, P4, that's typically around 1%, 2%, 4%, and 9%. So people are really not stopping and reading those introductory panel texts. It's really the objects that draw people in those free gallery spaces. Now I want to move from structure to think about this idea about exhibitions having a voice. and thinking about this in terms of panel text. And we can see from previous exhibitions like the COVID exhibition how different voices can be incorporated. So we can think about voice of the exhibition and the organization, but we can also think about it as quotes from actual nurses, from practitioners. We think about including poetry to change the tone, the rhythm. And the question I think I have for you is, what voice needs to be included in this exhibition about nursing support workers? Who should be speaking here? Whose voices should we hear? You can see also, this isn't just a thing about text, but also about graphics. So, that you can see with the quotes here how by including these big quotation marks, by creating the speech bubbles, that they stand out from some of the other text that's included within the exhibition space. So when we think about this idea about writing text, there's a quote I use from Alexander Green, who's one of the curators at the British Museum, and her quote is, "There is no good writing, only good rewriting." And I find this very useful because it's very much kind of liberates us from worrying that our first text we write is not good enough, because you have to get something down and then rewrite it in order to make it better. And it's very helpful when thinking about that kind of the process of being edited. I'm going to use an example now from the COVID exhibition, just to think about an exhibition text and the type of labels that you do. So you have this doodle by the RCN member Jenna Assels from 2022, and the text goes, "This doodle was created by Jenna Assels in a series of creative doodling workshops run by graphic artist and facilitator Federica Giotti. Each shape in Jeanette's doodle represents a tier, which is connected to at least one other tier, representing nursing camaraderie and shared burden." This is very nice. It tells the visitor what they're seeing in front of them and tells it how it's created, but then it also talks about its symbolic meaning, its poetic meaning, and it's quite emotionally moving, and you can see how it connects to that overall idea about nursing during the COVID pandemic. Now, when we think about writing labels and exhibitions, I think it's often useful to think about this being a dialogue between ideas and things, a sort of balancing out of things between top down versus bottom up. So we are trying to kind of convey, these big overarching ideas, but then what do the objects say? How do they give us a different perspective? How can we think about a particular issue differently? And this is the kind of, I think, the balance that we have between those object labels and the wider kind of contextual stories that we want to provide. And on Wednesday, we're going to do an exercise to work on this. We're going to write an individual object label of 50 words for an object, and then we're going to put 80 words of text together, which is broader kind of contextual text. And the format for this is, we're going to have kind of the name of the image, or the date, the collection, the object text, and the contextual text together. So for the object text, what I want you to do is describe the object to a museum visitor as if you were looking at the object for the first time. I'm going to ask you, what is the hook that draws a visitor to this object? If you were showing someone it, what would be the first thing you would say to them to attract their attention, to make them look at it? And I'm going to give you an example of this. This is an object label I worked on at the British Museum, and it's called Head of Augustus, and it says, "This is the only bronze portrait of Augustus to have survived, with its original inlaid eyes, which stare out with a brooding intensity. Augustus is always depicted as a handsome youth to reflect his vitality. The head was originally attached to a statue in Egypt, but was decapitated by an invading army from Meroe in modern-day Sudan. They buried the head under a temple as an insult to Augustus. Ironically, it was this act of defiance that preserved the head." So within this, you have this statue, this head of Augustus, and it focuses on the eyes. It's the only statue with the eyes, to originally inlaid eyes, to have survived, and they stare at us with a brooding intensity. And it talks about then, how the head came to end up being kind of decapitated and preserved. The contextual text, I think, think of this as text that would traditionally go on a panel. This is broader, information that people would read on about in the room. How does this object fit into the wider thematic and narrative story told by the exhibition? Okay, a kind of history of nursing support workers. What larger contextual story do you need to frame? How can you draw on your research that you've done here? And this is the contextual information that went with this head. How did Rome become an empire? Augustus was the first emperor of Rome and used statues like this one to remind the emperor's largely illiterate population of his power. Augustus transformed Rome from a republic led by competing nobles to an empire ruled by one man. In 31 BC, he defeated the armies of Mark Antony and Cleopatra and made Egypt part of the empire. Augustus's role ushered in a period of long-lasting peace, and when he died, he was declared a god by the Roman people. Then you have the dates of the object, 27 to 25 BC, Meroe, Sudan, which is where the object was found, and bronze, and then the object registration number. And typically at the British Museum, we put this information at the bottom because it's generally used by specialist visitors, but then it's also, people know where it is, they can easily see it if they want to look for a particular date. And you can see basically within this contextual information, this really tries to contextualize and say, how, what was the relationship to Augustus to the wider Roman Empire? What historical changes did he bring? Why was he important as an emperor? In terms of choosing your object, there's a list that have been selected already that you've worked on, so you can either suggest and choose one of these from the selection that we've got for the session Wednesday, or on an object you've been researching yourself or thinking about including. This is an opportunity for you to kind of perhaps work up some text about it and think about how it might be incorporated into the exhibition. Writing tips that I'm going to give you, and I'll go over them again on Wednesday, just to think about when we're writing labels, how to go about doing that. So firstly, say what's important in the first sentence to begin. Don't bury it, don't hide it away. So in this example of the stone chopping tool, we begin with this stone chopping tool is the oldest humanly made object in the British Museum. There you go. Why is it important? This is the headline. It's the oldest object in the British Museum, humanly made anyway. And this is why it's worth, people stopping at and looking at this and finding out more as they walk through the galleries. Write what you see. So look at the object and try and describe it. So this is an example written by Tim Clark from the Japan Gallery called Figure of a Townsman. The figure gazes out at us with an air of calm. His crystal eyes give him a gently human expression. Many successful townsmen, as they grew older, took Buddhist vows. Like monks, they often had their heads shaved, abandoning vanity. Some continued to live busy, secular lives. Others went into semi-retirement to prepare spiritually for death. Townspeople believed that by making portraits such as this one, often as a memorial after death, they would preserve the success of their families. In effect, the head of the household was still watching over them. This is an example that begins by looking at the figure, gazing out at us with an air of calm. We are looking at it, but it is also looking at us, and it again looks at the eyes, how this gives him a gently human expression. It explains why he's got his particular appearance. He shaves his head as they took on Buddhist vows, and it kind of finishes again with this eye seeing motif. In effect, the head of the household was still watching over them. We're returning back to looking and the gaze here. Right for the other senses, so not just what you can see, but also what other elements of the object can you experience. So in this example of this ball cup, animal sculpture in silver was a fashionable choice for drinking cups around 1600 and was later collected by the Rothschilds. The head comes off to serve as a cup for alcohol poured from the hollow body. Used to toast guests, the cup celebrates the savagery of the wild boar as an animal of the hunt. It used to smell strongly of cherry brandy. So again, you have all this information, and then you have this very evocative idea that this object, smell of cherry brandy, this was what it was used to kind of contain. Important one, avoid difficult terminology if you can, but if it is necessary, explain it. So, in this example, from the British Museum, you have things like the geometric and orientalizing periods, you have specific periods related to Greece. None of these are given dates. Within our kind of nursing kind of context, I think it's important to think about what acronyms mean and what things that only a kind of nursing support worker or NHS worker would know. How would you explain these and make these accessible to a general audience? I favour the active tense. So active, A does something to be. So in this example, from this mine lintel, the mine queen Lady Shook pulls a rope embedded with thorns through her tongue. It's much more immediate, grabbing than this kind of passive, which in which something is done to be, usually by A. So to give you an example, this scene shows a rope embedded with thorns being pulled through the tongue of the mine queen Lady Shook. It's much more passive, and it gives less agency to Lady Shook herself. Finally, admit uncertainty. So if you don't know something, don't shy away from it, embrace it. Go in, use it to provoke questions with the visitor. So in this example of a swimming reindeer sculpture carved from mammoth ivory, we don't actually know what the sculpture was actually used for, but the label finishes with some provocative questions. Was this sculpture a means of communicating with the supernatural world, or a charm to guarantee a successful hunt at the end of the ice age, at the end of a bitterly cold ice age winter? So bring in these, if you don't know, use it to your advantage, to something to speculate with the visitors. So those are my text writing and interpretation tips. Hope that's been useful for you. Thank you very much for listening in advance. I will kind of go over these in person on Wednesday, but not in as much depth, as we won't have the time to do so. So hopefully this has been useful for you to kind of get your ideas, thinking about what interpretation is, and to prepare you for Wednesday. And I very much look forward to meeting you in person then. Thank you. Bye.